Hey, North Harbor. How are you this morning? Hope you're all doing well. Hope you're finding ways to connect with God and connect with one another, the few that you can during this time. It's time for our Bible from the barn, and we are winding up this series on social justice, and we have we have something that we need to tackle this morning as we wind down this series. This is an appropriate a book and a passage to look at for us today. I think that all of us would agree that there are issues in the world. I think everyone across the board would just say that, man, the world has some things that it needs to work on. It's broken in certain ways. We may disagree on what is broken and what needs healing. We may disagree on the method to approaching that, but we would all agree that the world is broken, and that there are areas, there are groups, and there are people groups in our world that need help. And so this series has been designed to, just think through, what does social justice look like? What does serving one another look like? And in those first 2 weeks that we had this, week 1 and 2, we looked at two foundational passages, Isaiah 58 and then Philippians 2. And so the two basic things we've looked at, there's plenty others we can cover, but one of the two basic things we've wanted to come back to on this series is that we need to act with compassion. We need to act in a way that divests ourselves of our time, our energy, our resources to help others. That if we're going to look to a broken world and reach out to help by God's power and God's grace, then we need to have compassion. We need to see each other with compassion and people groups with compassion, and we need to divest. We need to do something that's going to cost us, and Jesus does this. This is the way of Jesus. In that song in Philippians chapter 2, Jesus is talked about as one who empties himself, does not hold on tightly to his divine nature, but empties himself for the sake of others. And in doing that, God exalts him and lifts him up. And that's our hope for ourselves as well. We place our faith in Jesus, that as we serve him, we are also filled and lifted up by God, that God will be with us. And so, as we've talked about different issues, and we've covered a bunch, we've tried to take a look at different sides of many issues. But I think that there's a more foundational question that I have failed to ask. And so this week and a little bit next week, we're gonna turn the mirror a little bit instead of the world, and look at ourselves. And the deeper question is this. It is almost absurd to ask it, but we got to ask it. We have to ask this question. We have to ask ourselves and answer this honestly. Do we believe that they, whoever they is, that group of people, do we believe that they are deserving of our help and our mercy? Do we believe that they deserve it? And when you listen to people talk about the problems in this world, it doesn't take long to realize that people believe that some groups don't deserve it, or some individuals don't deserve God's help, don't deserve compassion. I think of the debate on, or the not the debate, the reality of illegal immigrants in our country. A lot of people think that, you got to go through all the legal channels, and if they're just here illegally and we're paying taxes, then they don't, they kind of excuse themselves that way, and we can put them aside and deal with them a bit more harshly. I've heard people talking about people who are on government assistance, on welfare, speak about them as if they just pulled themselves up by their bootstraps and everything would be okay. And you kind of lump everyone into this group and say, essentially with our words and our actions, they don't deserve our help. They can help themselves. Maybe, the enemies of the United States as a nation over the years have had different enemies, and there's this, can be this attitude towards a certain country, certain people groups, or certain national group, that they don't deserve our help, and we tend to see them as a group instead of as individuals. In a political, election year for our president, politics, to talk about politics on both sides of the aisle, the conservative and the liberal, the Democrats and the Republicans, just the way we talk about each other seems to indicate that we believe they don't deserve compassion. Maybe it's sometimes the way we see the wealthy. We see some people who are wealthy and have enough to share, and we wonder why they aren't doing more, they aren't sharing more, and we just think that they have all their resources taken care of, and they're fine. We don't need to think about them. In reality, we're all people. We all have hurts. We all have disappointments. We all have dreams that are deferred and all that sort of thing. Pollution. I've heard people talk about this, that I've talked about the environment with someone, and they responded by saying, well, it's these underdeveloped countries where most of that pollution is ending up in the ocean. And it just had this attitude that are just kind of writing them off like, it's their problem, not our problem. And so when we do that, we don't see them with compassion. Maybe it's our view of people from other faiths or other denominations. Maybe, within a church group, a church community, particularly on the conservative side, the evangelical side of the church, there seems to be this view of those who live sort of a promiscuous lifestyle, and we write those people off and say, you sort of dug your own hole, and there's this attitude that we're just going to let them, they made their own choices and they made the wrong choices, and now they're suffering. And there just seems to be a lack of compassion. Do we really see people as deserving of God's love? Maybe we get more personal here. Rather than people groups, we think of individuals that have hurt us personally, or that have hurt us, and despite our attempts to fix things, have continued to hurt us and continue to hurt us and continue to hurt us. Maybe it's people close to us, relatives, neighbors, best friends, people that hurt us personally. And inside, we have a really hard time opening up our heart to them. One of the things about Jesus is that one of the radical elements of his message is that everyone is invited to the table. Everyone is invited to sit at his table. Everyone. And I think this morning we need to think about that, how far that reaches. Everyone is everyone. I mean, that reaches pretty far, right? So we need to think about that. Do you believe that these people, these groups, whatever that group is for you, are they deserving of God's grace? God's kingdom, Jesus' kingdom, is made up of these people, of everyone. Everyone is invited to his table. So what we're going to look at this morning is actually the book of Jonah. Yeah, we're going to go to the Old Testament. It's in the prophets. He's one of the prophets. And what's interesting about Jonah is while most of the prophets that we read are talking about God's judgment on Israel or other countries, and the focus is on the message that those countries or people or Israel are receiving, Jonah is very different. Jonah is more about the prophet than the message he's giving. And we're going to see that. So Jonah is called by God to go and speak, to be a prophet to the city of Nineveh. Now, Nineveh is the capital of the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrians, they did some nasty things. I mean, when you were dominated by Assyria, when they conquered your country, there were some bad things that would happen. Torture and death and just bad stuff. And Nineveh is the capital of all of it. And God calls Jonah, a prophet, to go and speak to Nineveh, to call them to repent from their ways, to change, and to have faith in God. And so the Assyrians, the Assyrian Empire, just like the Egyptians in the book of Exodus, just like the Babylonians and the other books of the prophet, and just like Rome in the New Testament, becomes a symbol of evil, just of human wickedness. It's like when you read about Assyria, you're reading about this group of people that symbolizes wickedness. We have our version of that in the United States as well. Back in the 80s, when you'd have these like action movies, the bad guys were the Russians. This is during the Cold War. The bad guys were the Russians, and nowadays, the bad guys might be in these movies, in these Hollywood movies, the bad guys might be Muslims, or it might be people from China, or it might be Korea, or whatever. We have our version of other nations symbolizing evil or badness, and that's what the Assyrian Empire does here. It's just a place that no Israelite prophet would want to go. And sure enough, Jonah doesn't go. He runs in the opposite direction. God says, go to Nineveh. He goes the other way. He goes towards Tarshish, and he gets on a boat. So not only does he go to the other, a city in the other direction, he gets on a boat and goes out to the ocean. And when a big storm arises, these sailors are wondering what's going on. God must be unhappy. The gods must be unhappy. Jonah says, no, it's not the gods. It's not, whatever gods you believe in. It's I'm running from God and I'm the problem. And then he throws himself over. And there's a sense in which this can look like he's doing a good thing for them, but I think he's just further trying to escape from this call that God has put on his life. He does not want to go to the Assyrians. And so the fish throws him up onto the sand. He has this prayer, and God calls him a second time. So we read this moment where God, now as we get into Jonah chapter 3, you could read this whole book as a family. I mean, it's like 2 pages in your Bible. That's it. 4 chapters, but it's only 2 pages long. They're really short. In verse 3, it says, the Lord spoke to Jonah a second time. Say, get up and go to the great city of Nineveh and deliver the message I have given you. So now in chapter 3, we have the second time God is saying, go to Nineveh. This time, Jonah obeyed the Lord's command and went to Nineveh, a city so large it took 3 days to see it all. It's a big city. On the day Jonah entered the city, he shouted to the crowds, 40 days from now, Nineveh will be destroyed. Now, this really looks like Jonah's finally come together, and he's finally, reaching out, and he's delivering this message of it's repentance, but what's open is God's mercy, that if they turn, then God will show them mercy. That's the message. And it looks like he's finally doing the right thing. But as you read this, I mean, look at this sentence. Look at the message in verse 4. 40 days from now, Nineveh will be destroyed. That's it. He doesn't say anything about God. He doesn't say anything about what they need to do. He doesn't give them any information. I mean, it's the shortest sentence ever. And it's so vague. It's so vague. Why? We're getting a view of this. He's going to put forth the minimum effort for this group of people, right? Have you ever felt like that? Have you ever done that before? Like, we know we should do something for someone. We know we should serve these people. And so with our words and our actions, we do sort of like the minimum requirement, just to satisfy what God has called us to do, or just to satisfy our sense of, moral rightness or moral uprightness or whatever. We just do the minimum. That's what Jonah is doing here. He's just like, you know what? Here's the message. And he gives them this short sentence. And he's just not, this is the opposite of divestment. He's not really putting much effort into this at all. But what's interesting is in verse 5, the people of Nineveh believed God's message from the greatest to the least. They declared a fast and put on burlap to show their sorrow. I love this. The whole city responds from the greatest to the least. Everyone, every people group in that city is saying, we're in. And not only do they say that, but they declare a fast and they put on burlap. And so they actually do something. I mean, they respond physically to this vague message that he has given them. And I think that shows their willingness to turn, that they are open to what God has for them. And so they put on, they declare a fast and they put on burlap. And this is a way of sort of hopefully gaining the deity's sense of mercy. God will have pity on us if we fast and we take off all the nice clothes and we put on burlap. Maybe God will show compassion on us. So verse 6, we see not just people in general, but the king. When the king of Nineveh heard what Jonah was saying, he stepped down from his throne. What a beautiful image of someone who has repented. He stepped down from his throne, took off his royal robes. This is divestment. He's He's taking off all these things that give him privilege and rights and power. He takes them all. He divests himself. He dressed himself in burlap, sat on a heap of ashes. Then the king and his nobles sent this decree throughout the city. He says, no one, not even the animals from your herds or flocks, may eat or drink anything at all. People and animals alike must wear garments of mourning, and everyone must pray earnestly to God. They must turn from their evil ways and stop all of their violence. Who can tell? Perhaps even yet God will change his mind and hold back his fierce anger from destroying us. Now compare that whole sentence, that whole paragraph, to Jonah's message, which is like, 7 words long or something like that? I mean, they understand. The king steps down and he begins to, relate to his people, and he wants to share a message with them, and he wants to invest in them, divest of himself, invest in them, and hope that God will turn. All those words that the king says compared to the very few words that Jonah said. And so they respond and they look to God. That's the thing. They don't, they're looking to God. They're fasting, putting on burlap in hopes that God will have mercy to them, which means that their eyes are on God's mercy, not some sort of strategy to get out of the situation, not some sort of just way to cope or a way to deal or a way to turn away or there's not a strategy here. There is a turning toward God. It's those people, the ones we didn't think would ever respond, or more really, the ones we didn't really want to respond. When God saw, in verse 10, what they had done and how they'd put a stop to their evil ways, he changed his mind and did not carry out the destruction he had threatened. They were delivered. They were saved. They were brought into the fold. They were invited to sit at the table, and God accepted them. God accepted them. And so it's interesting. And now we turn back to Jonah. And he says and this is in chapter 4, verse 1. This change of plans greatly upset Jonah. He became very angry. So he complained to the Lord about it. Didn't I say before I left home that you would do this, Lord? That is why I ran away. I knew that you're merciful and compassionate, slow to get angry, and filled with unfailing love. You are eager to turn back from destroying people. Just kill me now, Lord. I'd rather be dead than alive if what I predicted will not happen. He knows something about God. He's experienced God's love. He's experienced God's grace. He's experienced God's goodness. And the bottom line is he just doesn't want to see that for other people. He doesn't want to see it for other people. He knows something about God that they don't know, and he doesn't want them to know. He doesn't want them to learn. And so in verse 4, we have a question. The Lord replied to Jonah and said, here's the question, is it right for you to be angry about this? And those questions in the Bible, they pop up every once in a while and they hang there. And it's good for us to hang there with it, to hang with the question, to meditate on it, to let it sit there. Is it right for us to be angry about that? Is it right for us to see people that way? Is it right for us to withhold all these good things we know about God from other people? Now, it would seem like that the question I want to lead forward with is, do you see people or groups or individuals like this? Like, do you have the same attitude? Do you see people like this? That's not the question. The question's harder than that. Okay? The whole book assumes that we do have people like that. So the real question, which is much more harder for us to accept, is which groups do we see like that? This whole book of Jonah is really not about Nineveh. It's not about the king of Nineveh. It's not about Assyria. It's not about the fish. In fact, there's not a ton about God here. Just a little bit. All good stuff, but just a little bit. What it's about is Jonah. What it's about is me and being honest. It's not a question of, do you see people like this? The question is, which people do you see like this? Which people do you believe are undeserving of God's love or God's best? And oftentimes, let's be honest, when we think about that group or that group of people coming to God, what we envision is that they end up looking like us. That they'll take on our cultural norms, that they'll take on our religious activities. They'll look like us. But that's not the case here. They are them. They are them. God says to stop the violence, turn back to Him. He doesn't say change their cultural norms, doesn't say change their pattern of life. Doesn't say you need to make them look like Jonah. They can be themselves, but just turn to God. Jesus demonstrated this in radical ways, and this is part of what got Him killed. As we approach Holy Week, Good Friday, this is part of what got Jesus nailed to a cross, is that He demonstrated this sort of radical acceptance into the kingdom. The people that made up His kingdom were people we did not expect, people that the religious establishment did not expect, that the Romans did not expect. Tax collectors, people that collected tax for Rome from Jewish people, prostitutes, non-Jewish people. Jesus lifts up in praise of their faith, as opposed to His own Jewish brothers and sisters sometimes. Jesus' kingdom is made up of those people. And so as we go forward in this social justice series, as we kind of wrap it up, we need to come back to some basic questions. Not if we have this attitude, but who do we have this attitude towards? Because I guarantee you, you do. I do. And you do. We have that attitude. We just need to look honestly at ourselves, brutally at ourselves, and see where we find that. So your homework this week is, first of all, go and watch the Bible Project video about the book of Jonah. You know how they do those overviews of a book? Go ahead and watch the one on Jonah. There's a link in the liturgy that was sent out, or you could just search for it at thebibleproject.com and watch the whole overview of Jonah. It's fascinating. It's great. And then with the people you're gathered with, if it's family, and include kids with this, if you're parents, get your kids talking about this. Whoever you're with, if you're not with anyone, just think through this on your own. Who are the people, groups, or individuals that you don't think deserve forgiveness? Be honest. Be honest and make the list. Create a list among those with whom you're gathered. Then I want you to read Jesus' first sermon in Matthew. So read Matthew 5, 3-16. That's the Beatitudes. We get this introduction to Jesus' kingdom. But then Matthew 5, 38-48. This is the important one. Matthew 5, 38-48. Jesus does a sermon on how to treat enemies. And so with that list you've created, I want you to think about Jesus' words in Matthew 5. How do you view your enemies? How will you approach them? And then how will you practically live out Jesus' instructions on engaging your enemies? Those people you don't believe deserve God's love. So this is about looking at our own prejudice, and looking at our prejudice is an important way on how we deal with social justice. All right, so God bless. I hope you guys are all doing well. Again, reach out, call, email. If you need anything from us, from me, or the rest of the staff, we are here for you, and hope you're doing well. And we're looking into doing this live. Okay, so keep your ear to the ground, and we'll let you know what's coming up. Have a great Sunday. Bye.